Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Paul Worthington. I'm the Director of Research and Development for Lindamood-Bell Learning Processes. You know, when the recent NAEP scores came out, it became apparent that it was probably time to have a conversation about, given the nature of these scores, to have a detailed look on why literacy reform keeps failing. And in this case, I mean, going back even 50 years to see what's going on, wherein we have not seen the progress that we would have liked to see. So I'm not big on the quotes part of this, but let's set the stage here to take a look at what's happened historically. For 50 years, the federal government, including policymakers, researchers, educators, and experts, have attempted to reform, revise, and restructure how to teach reading and education. Each was supposed to improve upon America's literacy crisis. Yet millions of students still struggle. Well, why is that? Traditional reading instruction guidance, even based upon the current science of reading, which we're all too familiar with, claim to be the most comprehensive evidence-based model of how to teach reading. Currently, it is not yielding results. Is it possible that a more comprehensive theoretical evidence-based model beyond just language skills is currently available? Let's dig into this. Historically, if we think about it, even back in the 70s, when IDEA was passed, based upon the needs, special needs of the population and the individuals with disabilities. And if you just quickly look through this, a lot of this, for those of you who've been around for a long time, going back as far as 86, when the Simple View of Reading was published, which is currently still in vogue. We went through the reading wars, phonics versus whole language. 1990, the Improving America's Schools Act. And there are just some figures in here in terms of the money that was spent on this. In 98, the feds instituted comprehensive school reform issues, and there's a dollar figure that went with that. If we keep going, just hitting on some of the rest of these, most of you are familiar that the National Reading Panel report was published in the year 2000. That's a quarter century ago, identifying the big five components of reading. 2001, No Child Left Behind was passed, which became what we're currently doing with ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was passed in 2010. Here we are in 2024, right around the time that COVID happened. The science of reading was basically legislated and passed through multiple state departments of education and legislatures. So what's occurred? As we've been going through this? Why are we still in the condition that we're in with the National Educational Association of Educational Progress? You all know the statistics on this. 15% of the school population in America have qualifying issues where special education is concerned. 85% of those students have a primary learning disability in reading, and the most common of which is dyslexia, I think, as most of you know. We're going to talk about that in a minute, because that tends to be a good marker on whether or not we're making progress in teaching children to read. Straight from the U.S. Department of Education, today's NAEP results reveal a heartbreaking reality for American students and confirm our worst fears. This is an interesting confession from the U.S. DOE. Not only did most students not recover from the pandemic-related learning loss, but those students who were the most behind and needed the most support have fallen even further behind. And despite the billions of dollars that the federal government invests in K-12 annually, and the approximately $190 billion in federal pandemic funds, our education system continues to fail students across the nation. What do we do about it? You've probably seen the data on this. When we look at the NAEP scores out of 2024 on below basic, it's 2 points below where it was clear back in 1992. There were a few changes where it was a little bit better, but clearly we're not doing any better, at least in fourth grade. If we take a look at eighth grade, is it any better? Actually, no. The below basic scores hit the 33, again from 92, from 31. So the numbers of children who are below basic is actually increasing. So the current reform effort, the science of reading, representing the current formula to improve literacy rates. What's the detail on that? Fundamentally, it's been based on the simple view of reading published by Tunmer in '86. The simple formula that they put forth is you take decoding times linguistic comprehension, and the combination of those two, correctly taught or addressed, equals reading comprehension. So keep this in mind, that reading, or the print code, and language, or how it is that we're comprehending, the assumption was if you have linguistic comprehension, which research shows very clearly is not all children have linguistic comprehension, then immediately the simple view of reading has a contaminant in it. If they can't comprehend linguistically, in spite of the fact that their decoding might be good, then what's their reading comprehension going to be like? Think about what the human brain must do to read and learn. A point that we'd like to emphasize in this presentation is that sensory input, if you think about the sensory information coming into the human brain, is being the primary foundation for all cognition and successful learning, including reading. And when you look at the current theoretical models that support reasoning, folks would generally agree that that is the proposition. You know, we have phonemic awareness. We need to auditorily perceive the number, order, and sequence of sounds in words. The orthographic piece, we need to have memory for letters and so forth. But is it really that simple? If we take a look at the comprehensive challenge being more than just teaching reading, most important variable, what are the most important variables to increase student achievement? Let's look at this globally for a second. Obviously, we have the biological code, which let's say it accounts for 75% of the variance on when a child lands on the planet. Obviously, whatever it is that they've, whatever that's been brought forth from the genetic code when they land in kindergarten. Here's the rest of the formula. If we're really going to tackle at a global level, nationally, or even down to districts, schools, classrooms, children, what are the variables that we have to control for in order to address student achievement? Number one, knowing that the biological code is already there. We have to do differential diagnosis. Let's be clear, the assessment protocols necessary to determine what a child needs or what they're at risk for can be carefully diagnosed. And then secondly, if and that's determined that there are problematical areas, then of course the ideal would be customized intervention on whatever it is that shows up that's affecting their profile. Now it gets a little more complicated. We have to take a look at what's going on in terms of the environmental complications. In the genetics world, how are those children's genes being expressed? Broadly, that's referred to as epigenetics. Guess what the top variable is now from an environmental standpoint? And again, this won't be surprising to anybody that affects student achievement where reading is concerned. It's the professional competency, and I might just say the aggregate professional competency of the teachers who have contacts with those children to teach reading. Secondly, a second variable that stands out in terms of addressing the needs of children, particularly for those who are at risk, is the amount of customized intervention. If you have a child that's more than one or more standard deviations behind the mean for their age and or grade level, it's clearly, as mandated in the National Reading Panel report, they're going to need intensive intervention to get caught up. Secondly, or actually third, regardless of whether or not a teacher has the competency to teach reading, leadership in buildings, in districts, in legislatures, and state departments of education, supporting what that teacher needs to do in that classroom is absolutely critical. So leadership plays a key role in whether or not children are going to be moved. Now, keep thinking globally about the National Association of Educational Progress. It's huge to be looking at the aggregate criteria that needs to be addressed to meet the needs of children. And clearly, last but not least, parents need to be co-opted in the process to make sure that they are informed of the process by which children are going to learn to read. If we think about this comprehensive challenge, what we really begin to discover is that reading is a subcomponent of learning at large. Reading is just an artifact of being taken print off the page and receiving meaning from what it is that's read. A more precise phrase than the science of reading may be something that we would call a cognitive science of learning, because we've got to look beyond reading in order to address the comprehensive set of issues that children need to be faced with. Let me propose that there's a theory that better embraces this more comprehensive look in addressing the needs of children, spilling over into the cognitive science of learning. Dr. Alan Pavio developed back in the 70s a theory called dual coding theory, where he states that cognition is proportional to the extent that the coding mechanisms of mental representations, if you want to call it imagery for short, and language are integrated. How would that work? He suggests that linguistic, cognitive competence and performance are mediated by mental representations, even including issues such as dyslexia for children. Let's dig into that a little bit. For years at Lindamood-Bell, we've been putting forth this paradigm, this Venn diagram on addressing sensory cognitive functions that underlie the component parts of reading, with comprehension being the global idea or the goal of reading, not only of being able to read, but also to understand what you read, beyond what you read, but also to be able to listen and comprehend oral language. We all know about the contribution of phonemic awareness on the auditory side that develops, for example, word attack skills. On the visual side, we need to have sight words. In other words, there has to be something that's referred to as orthographic awareness. We just call that symbol imagery, part and parcel of the same thing. And we also know that oral vocabulary that affects contextual reading fluency, vocabulary being an artifact of comprehension. When all are put together as the subcomponents, then you increase the probability that comprehension will be intact. But if you think about where we are in the science of reading embraces and it's fine. The question is it comprehensive in addressing the global needs of children? It comes at the issue of tackling reading with one code, language only. It assumes the ability to provide mental representations. And now neuroscience has evidence that just as there are individual differences, for example, in phonemic awareness, there are enormous individual differences to be able to use the imaginal codes in our sensory system in the human brain. The simple view of reading, exemplified by the current generally accepted model of the science of reading, only looks at language as a component. What this proposition suggests is that the cognitive science of learning requires, broadly speaking, two codes, language and mental representations. How many of you think about this? Finish this phrase: a picture's worth 1,000 words. If I were to ask you, tell me about the last book that you read, what would your referential processing be? You would have to go into your mind's eye and recall the images that were generated from the book that you read. Is that any different than a child being in a fifth grade classroom when it comes time to take a test to, for example, convince the teacher that they understand all the vocabulary terms in a social studies lesson about landforms? Dual coding theory, exemplified by the sensory cognitive approach to teaching and all learning, including reading, is a suggestion that time has come. And if you want to look at just a schematic of what Dr. Pavio put forth on the science, if you look at the current science of reading, on the language side, Dr. Pavio suggested logogens, the logographic components or the verbal components, the structure of our language system. But isn't language only referential processing to talk about imagery, or what he calls imagens? So all of our sensory systems come in through the verbal stimuli, the nonverbal stimuli, through referential connections, and therein lies the wisdom, as this proposition goes, if it's right, about dual coding. We've been saying for years, if you look at it from the reading standpoint, phonemic awareness, symbol imagery, the ability to create mental representations for sounds and letters and words. There's another component, and think about it from a comprehension standpoint. If somebody has an understanding of a particular concept, then the probabilities or the direct relationship on having concept imagery that corresponds to whatever that concept is increases the probability that comprehension will occur, all the way from vocabulary up to abstract language. So there are two applied types of dual coding. If you think about it from a reading standpoint, where symbol imagery is imagery for sounds and letters and within words, concept imagery is an image whole for oral and written language. Actually, very recently, in the 7th edition of this particular book, edited by Elverman and Unroe, etc., DCT is among the strongest candidates for developing a unified, scientifically based theory of literacy. The principles of DCT apply to grapheme phoneme correspondence, the acquisition of vocabulary, etc., all the way through the construction of mental models of text episodes and imaginative responses to text, including the social construction of self and others in literacy encounters. The DCT model addresses decoding as well as oral and written language comprehension and memory. So where does DCT fit among other models of teaching and reading and learning? Based on the recent national scores in reading, it's clear that were not done with the necessary research addressing remediation. The implications, for example, if we look at the issue with the dyslexia conundrum in our public educational system, we find that addressing dyslexia must be comprehensive from a medical model. Remediation will require extraordinary and intense environmental intervention, as I indicated earlier. And to teach reading, especially where dyslexia is concerned, scientific diagnosis and evidence-based customized interventions must be understood. Where are we in the science of doing this? Thus, a new line of dyslexia research in concert with brain research has been necessary. We've taken that whole idea out of necessity to heart. But before that, let's take a contemporary look. In a recent piece written in Education Week, here's the following quote. Experts blame the misperception that dyslexia can be fixed, largely on a general lack of understanding of how people learn to read. This particular individual indicates that having been in the field for close to 40 years, I can tell you that dyslexia is a lifelong neurodevelopmental disability that affects how the brain processes language. And he ends it by saying it has no cure. Do you accept that? If that's the case, that in part might explain why we're seeing the scores that we are with the National Association of Educational Progress. From our standpoint, our 30-year journey in trying to understand this better, in consolidating dual coding theory, sensory cognitive intervention research, including dyslexia and autism, where we've done research with language comprehension, we have found some interesting data that challenges the notion that dyslexia, for example, is a lifelong issue. These are our collaborators over these last 30 years, largely in the world of dyslexia research. Let me just highlight some of it. Here's, in these 3 decades of neuroscientific reading behavioral interventions research, and this is all based on peer-reviewed published information. You can get off our website if you're interested in this. At the University of Washington, Stanford, at MIT, we find that a dose-response relationship exists between intervention hours. In other words, the more hours you get, the more likely that you're going to get the gains that you want to see in reading, with structural brain changes in white matter plasticity, cortical growth, and visual word form area expansion accompanies these skill gains. We've also seen, largely at Georgetown, growth in gray matter volume and white matter volume post-intervention. Reading gains correlate with increased gray matter volume in memory-related regions of the white matter and changes in the reading tracks, with effects maintained after interventions. So this is promising in begging skepticism about whether or not reading issues can be remediated. At MIT, the effects of summary intervention coupled with cortical growth in lower SES children, the interventions yield significant benefit for lower SES children with reading disabilities. These are all positive notations. Even more, while interventions statistically enhance reading fluency, decoding and comprehension, some neurological differences in dyslexic brains, such as the visual word form area abnormalities and gray matter volume differences, persist post-intervention. Why would that be? In these particular studies that we did, we had a targeted amount of intervention. In the case of the University of Washington and Stanford, we had the amount of intervention that was provided, notwithstanding fantastic growth, was 160 hours of intensive intervention. What it would have been if it had been 200 hours or 240 hours. I'm going to show you some data that corresponds to that question. And finally, on the neuroanatomical side, in looking at comprehension, we have a program that addresses concept imagery. In other words, decoding is not an issue. ASD students showed, and these were studies that were done at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. Autistic spectrum disorder students showed significant reading comprehension gains along with changes in their brain connectivity following the use of the visualizing and verbalizing program to address the needs of these kids. So let's dig a little deeper on these sensory cognitive issues with dual coding. If we take a look at since 2008, we've been tracking data on all the students that we've seen in our learning centers across the United States and in the UK and Australia. 30,000 children. When we take a look at the aggregate of those students who show profiles consistent with dyslexia, 44% or over 13,000 of the students received intensive intervention for decoding. But here's what's interesting. 9,700 of those 13,000 had no previous diagnosis of dyslexia. If they're not diagnosed, are they going to be treated? Remember that variable of absolutely needing to have differential diagnosis. 3,600 of those students were previously diagnosed with dyslexia when they came into our learning center. If we look at the previous diagnosis, having for those students, average age beginning of fifth grade or about 10.2, when you look at the pre and post percentiles across the spectrum on those areas that are classically associated with dyslexia, especially if you start looking at word attack, word recognition, and if they decode better, guess what happens with their comprehension? These kids are leaving the lower quartile in terms of comparatively against the population, their age and or grade level, and they're moving up into a normal range of functioning above the 25th percentile. If you want to think about it in standard scores, there's the same thing, only in standard score gains. Can reading be normalized? There's the question, using the idea behind addressing the needs of dyslexic students. So we did another study. If we take the students that we saw or that were seen at the University of Washington and at Stanford, it's part of a National Science Foundation study, and we look at all the students that were undiagnosed that I referred to earlier, the ones that were diagnosed, and then the 72 students that were in the study. When you look at their average standard score gains, what you see is that we're making across that population similar gains across those populations. And in the case of, are we moving them out of the lower quartile with an increase above the 25th percentile? All the students, we had 69% of those students left the bottom quartile and they're entering into a normal range of functioning. And it's the average between all three of those categories. So the point being is the challenge that we're faced with is not buying into the idea that students cannot be remediated. What's the effect on comprehension? If they're decoding better for those populations that we served in this study, sure enough, comprehension. And what would happen is we went from 160 hours to say 200. Would that number increase or would it go down? The answer is obvious. We were on the right track at addressing the needs of these children. So there's that variable, that environmental variable of increasing the amount of instruction. Said differently from Dr. Jason Yateman at Stanford, who headed up these studies both at the University of Washington and at Stanford. While many parents and teachers might worry that dyslexia is permanent, reflecting intrinsic deficits in the brain. These findings demonstrate that targeted intensive reading programs not only lead to substantial growth, but they change the underlying wiring of the brain's reading circuitry. So now we have behavioral evidence in the pre and post testing on their growth, as well as the neuroscientific evidence that corresponded to it. So the summary on this and findings show the intervention's positive effect in developing dyslexic readers' sensory cognitive functions based upon the tenets of dual coding theory. In other words, we've got significant remediation effects. The findings add validity to the tenets of DCT, addressing phonemic awareness and symbol imagery for both phonological and orthographic processing with dyslexic profiles. So that's all fine. What happens when we leave the lab and we go into public educational environment? We spent 10 years in Pueblo, Colorado, in the state of Colorado, in a district that had 30% minority and free reduced, a 5% point. Over those 10 years, if we look collectively on the point improvements by third grades in the Colorado stat test of proficiency, that was the state's gains over those 10 years. In Pueblo, they had the additional issue of 60% minority and free reduced status. Over that same period of time, the district at large had a 16% point improvement by third grade on the CSAT test. Within 8 years, we had 470 students moved out of special ed, 9,000 at-risk students receiving intensive reading, and over 25,000 students received developmental reading instruction. The point being is that it can be with the right amount of professional development. Remember that variable, the competency of teaching staff, you can achieve the gains that we're seeing there. The emphasis on associated language with multisensory mental images is a direct application of dual coding theory. Dr. Mark Sadowski, in a publication published in 2006 on the effects of a theoretically based large-scale reading intervention, in this case it was dual coding theory, states, the emphasis on associated language with multisensory images is a direct, I'm repeating myself for a point, it's a direct application of dual coding. He further states that any theory of reading or writing that does not eventually align with the broader theory of general cognition will not endure. Reading and writing are cognitive acts. They're more than just reading acts. Evidence-based intervention, if we think about this, where cognitive science of learning actually encompasses the science of reading, evidence-based interventions now show that significantly more individuals can learn to read and comprehend to their potential, including those qualifying for special ed and dyslexia. You know, globally, when we look at our whole population, why this is important for an additional reason, if you look at the percentages of students of those roughly 30,000 kids that come into our centers since 2008, if you look at the percentage of kids with decoding issues, with comprehension issues, or some combination of both, check it out. 30% have both. 24% comprehension, and look at decoding, 45%. There's an aggregate of these children. Some of them have multiple issues going on for them. And if we look at their comprehension gains, dual coding based on the intervention, just on the comprehension side of things, having already looked at dyslexia, looks what happens if whether or not we're normalizing comprehension for students who have no decoding issues but are in the lower quartile on average with 105 hours of instruction. We're normalizing their reading comprehension skills. standard score that corresponds to the same thing. Highly, largely significant scores under standard scores. You know, especially since the pandemic, we started worrying about virtual learning, whether or not kids can learn online as well as they do in person. I'm not going to read all this, but if we're looking at NAEP reading profile changes, what does the research show about the effectiveness of educational technologies, especially with the advent of artificial intelligence? Does the impact vary when it comes to teaching reading skills into student population? If we're looking at that specifically, we decided to go ahead and do an analysis. How does online intervention statistically compare to in-person construction? When the pandemic hit, luckily we were already tooled up to offer virtual learning and teaching reading the exact same way, only virtually, as we do in our clinics. The predicate of success is primarily the legitimacy of the science and the fidelity of delivering significant student learning. We must measure for our standpoint, from a quality control standpoint, we really need to measure any interventions in our practices using virtual instruction. So we ask ourselves the question, here are the numbers. We started looking at this based on a challenge in the work that we'd been doing in very remote communities in the state of Alaska, delivering instruction virtually in remote villages in the state of Alaska. We took that technology, we started looking at it, we had it in place by the time the pandemic hit, and there you can see the numbers. So we looked at that from an analytical standpoint to ask the simple question, can we achieve online learning gains to the same extent that we can do virtually in person? Again, using our sensory cognitive programs propped up by dual coding theory. So here are the comparative learning gains. On decoding, if you take a look at the magnitude of change across all those issues for online students as compared to in-person, what you see, cutting to the chase on this, is that we have comparable gains. In other words, we were able to achieve the same results for children online, the same programs, only delivering it virtually as compared to person. What about comprehension? Same effect. If we're worried about comprehension, we're statistically getting the same gains. They're the pre-post standard scores for children who were in both categories. So across the board, online and in-person students tested significantly higher on post-instruction on all measures, indicating that growth was comparable in progress between online learning and business as usual. We wanted to ask one more question. And the work that we did at Stanford as a follow-up to the University of Washington, we engaged in a replication study at Stanford where we took, again, asking ourselves the same question, can we get the same gains with dyslexic students at Stanford as compared to the dyslexic students at Lindamood-Bell? The comparative study yielded the following results. Of the 72 neuroscientific students from our collaborative research study with the University of Washington and Stanford, 58% of those kids received online, and the analysis compared the instruction groups to determine if the mode of instruction had any significance on students' overall gains. As it turns out, the gains were comparable. In summary, the in-person dyslexic intervention as compared to what it was that we had delivered virtually to the same population of dyslexic students in person turned out to be the same with online individuals. And we had a surprise. Participants in the online intervention had statistically significantly higher growth in fluency measures as compared to participants who received instruction in person. You know, I recognize that this is a lot of information, and we're happy to share it with you a little bit more. But in contrast to the view that learning loss in reading is due to virtual instruction, the analysis shows that it's not. The growth of students who have received online instruction is comparable. And so that's very encouraging for students that cannot get to environments where they might receive in-person instruction. So here's the question, wrapping things up. What have we learned? Will NAEP proficiency levels ever change? Are learning disabilities impossible to remediate? Has the current science of reading impacted the national reading literacy rate? Is there a more comprehensive model to improve literacy? Obviously, we're arguing that there is. America's children reading 40% below basic is unacceptable. The new cognitive science of learning, we think, can significantly help address the crisis. Finally, and this just came out within the last week, the Association of Supervision and Curriculum Development have some thoughts on dual coding the cognitive science of learning. I'm just going to read this and we'll end here. Science has told us how we can optimize our brains for great learning. Now is the time for educators to capitalize on it. What ends up in a learner's memory is not simply the material presented, it's the product of what the learner thought about when he or she encountered the material, not just the language. And to quote Dr. Alan Pavio, our brains have the remarkable ability to focus on visual and verbal information at the same time, the ability called dual coding. Lab experiments show that we process learning better when it's presented visually and verbally. I want to thank you for your attention. That's my direct number. You're welcome to contact me if you have additional questions on the research side of things and the direction that we're taking and pushing, we think, a much more comprehensive worldview in the science of learning. Thank you for your time and your patience.